We want to welcome you to the second session of our training about interpretation services and collaborating with interpreters. Ana Soler, the founder and CEO of CESO Inc., is going to continue talking with us and help us to go a little deeper into the interpretation process. Ana, we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to see everybody and happy Friday. Yes, we're ready for a break. I know we're all ready for a break. So I want to again welcome you and thank you so much for coming in today. I do want you to get a little bit of practice in the actual interpretation process today. So those of you who collaborate with interpreters, you'll be able to collaborate with interpreters, perhaps with a different framework on how to take certain steps. And those of you who interpret will be able to kind of apply some of the skills that I'm gonna go through briefly, okay? So I know that many of you already interpret, so this one might be a little bit of a review. It could also be adding to some of the skills that you are already using. So I do recommend that you keep, an open mind if you have been doing this for a long time. Perhaps some of the things that I'm going to show you will help you, improve the process and really create that collaboration with providers. Okay, so just, figure out if there are things that maybe you can incorporate or things that maybe you can change or things that maybe you should keep on doing. Okay, so we're going to be talking about some of the things that we should do as interpreters before we even go into a meeting to interpret, what we should do during the meeting, and perhaps what we need to do after the meeting to make things go a little bit smoother. Okay, so how many of you are familiar with the pre-session during a meeting? You probably have already done it, but maybe you were not aware that that's what it was called. Have you heard of the pre-session before? So Elizabeth, yes, no? Okay, got it. So let me show you what that is. So just before we get to that, there are certain things that we need to do to be able to prepare before we go into a meeting where an interpreter is needed. And the reason we do that is because the more information we have ahead of time, the better prepared we will be as interpreters. So at any time you have, a request to interpret, whether it's at a clinic or a school, really, in any setting, just make sure that you get as much information as possible about what you're getting into as an interpreter. If you are the provider, make sure that you give us as interpreters as much information as you can, because that will help us really prepare our brains for that type of vocabulary. So if you tell us, for example, if we're going to a school, let us know what type of meeting this will be. Is this going to be a parent-teacher conference, which may be a little bit shorter? If it's going to be something related to special education, those meetings tend to be a little bit longer. If you have an idea of the child's disability or the patient's disability, that will help us kind of prepare mentally for that particular vocabulary. So giving us as much information as you can ahead of time will help us come in with some tools already. Definitely, if you are the interpreter, one of the best suggestions I have for you is to make sure that you arrive on, a little bit ahead of time, not right when the meeting starts, because that will give you the opportunity to really connect with the provider, with the teacher, with, physician, whoever you're speaking with, and really get as much information as you possibly can, again, to help you prepare mentally, and really, terminology wise for that meeting that you're getting into. So, I would say, if it's possible to arrive about 10 minutes before and have that, pre-meeting with the person that you're speaking to, will be really, really helpful. You'll get a lot of information. Let me give you an example. If you are interpreting for a speech and language pathologist and you're working with them to help assess a child, you're going to need a lot of information, right? You're going to need, some, information about what it is that you're assessing. Of course, those assessments are really, really important. So you want to get as much feedback from the speech pathologist in terms of what you need to be asking and how to ask the questions, okay? So definitely make sure that you arrive with enough notice time. So.
May I add something about
yes,
our
absolutely.
program?
Sure.
As far as I know the bilingual employees with our agency may have an advantage of working fairly closely with the people that they may be interpreting for. And so we might find that that flow of information would be pretty readily available. So just an idea of what kind of meeting it is, what kind of situation that you're going to be in can be really easily addressed by maybe the fellow employee that you may be interpreting for. So a lot of times these interactions may be within the agency, and so you can just make sure that you know if you're going to be interpreting what that meeting is going to be about and what the intention is of the person, what information is going to be passed. And so that it's the same concept, and just sometimes our group, may be interpreting within our agency, and so then that helps to just to prepare ahead of time as well.
And that's great. And that's really the ideal situation, to have that type of collaboration with the people that you're going to be interpreting with. Absolutely love that. Because that dialogue, even before you go into as an interpreter, that dialogue is just key. It'll give you so much information so that at least you know what you're getting into. I've had interpreters that come into a situation where child abuse there's a situation related to child abuse, and they had no idea they were getting into. I mean, it's just, shocking. Number one, emotionally, it's difficult for the interpreter to get into something like that without some preparation. So I really love that you have that collaboration in your organization so that you can have a lot of information ahead of time. So that's great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And one of the things that we also do as we prepare as interpreters is we check the register level. So the register level is just the level of vocabulary that we use as interpreters, right? Sometimes we find that families may be able to understand the terminology that we throw at them, whether it's medical or social services or educational. But sometimes something about the family, or those of you, who have been doing this for a long time, you get to know the families really well, right? And you can tell that there might be some families that may need a little bit more help in terms of explaining some of the terminology that we say, right? And so that's, as an interpreter, you have to kind of adjust and determine, okay, am I really making myself understood? Do I need to explain terms in a different way? And of course, you always work with the provider. So those are not decisions that you have to make by yourself. You're always with somebody. So for example, if somebody throws an abbreviation and they say, okay, the program, I don't know, ABC is going to help this family, right? And you are not aware of what ABC stands for. So that is your cue, right, to intervene and ask and make sure that you understand the abbreviation so that you can explain it properly to the families. And also determine, if the provider can give you some examples so that you can help the families understand this information clearly without making assumptions, right? So it is important that we as interpreters do not make the assumption that all of our families need to have simplified information, because sometimes they're understanding everything that we're saying. But sometimes, you'll find and you'll get to know the family so well that you have to determine, okay, I probably need to explain this in a different way. And maybe I need to ask for examples. And, last time we talked about how in so many of our languages, sometimes we don't have some of those terms. So we have to adjust the language quite a bit. And so that's kind of what we're doing even before we go in to work as interpreters. So, oh, now it's moving. Okay. Another suggestion that I have for you, if you are working as interpreters, and those of you who collaborate with interpreters, is that interpreting in the first person is a little bit more efficient, and also emphasizes the fact that the interpreter is an impartial member of this meeting, right? Because again, as interpreters, we're not there to provide our opinions or biases or really include information that is not being communicated to us, right? So when you interpret in the first person, you're actually reducing the amount of words that you're saying, so it's a little bit more efficient, but you're also removing yourself, verbally from the situation, because you're basically speaking just as the same as the person who is speaking, right? You're basically repeating the messages. So in this example, for example, if I say, she says she is pleased to meet you, I am adding a lot more words than I really need to. So this skill doesn't come natural to us. It's a little strange at the beginning to start speaking in the first person as if you were the person, who's speaking. But it is a little bit more efficient, and it really kind of creates that sense that, okay, this person is speaking for the family, right? As the same person that is speaking. So when you practice, when I put you in small groups to practice, try to incorporate this skill if you can. If you've been doing this for a while, then that's great. This is pretty easy for you, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. So try it when we start to practice. But any questions about that one? Okay. Now, of course, in a virtual environment, this is a little different, right? But those of you are already working in a face-to-face setting. So seating arrangements are important, again, because the body language speaks louder than anything, right? So when you are as the interpreter, you're placing yourself. There are many different versions of this, but in the educational setting, for example, in a school, this is a little different because in schools we have different settings where parents meet with teachers, but usually in general, the interpreter should be between the provider and the patient, for example, right? So that basically the whole idea of this is to make sure that that eye contact happens, that body language happens, and that you as the interpreter does not physically block the body language that is being communicated from the provider to the parent or the patient. Because really, again, those meetings are about the provider and the patient, and you're there to kind of create a bridge between all of them. So this graph on the left, it's kind of the best practice, but I honestly think that as long as you are in the middle of both and that you're not blocking communication, either verbal or nonverbal communication, that's where you need to be. And our settings are very different. Sometimes if you're interpreting in a clinic, the rooms are very tiny. So it is important that you place yourself where communication can happen. That's the bottom line. Whether it's in a school or social service agency, wherever you are, just place yourself where communication, verbal and nonverbal, can happen. So if you see a graph like this, just kind of keep in mind that it's flexible. It just depends on the setup of the room and the people that you have. Sometimes you have 5 or 6 people in the room, and you have to interpret for all of them. So you have to figure out where best to sit in. So I have we work quite a bit with schools, and a lot of schools have started to suggest that the parents are the ones that need to sit first. So where the parent chooses to sit, then everybody else goes around the parent. And I think that's a nice practice, because we need to give the parent the power to sit wherever they feel more comfortable, and then we're the ones that need to kind of accommodate to that. And I really like that idea. So part of the preparation is a pre-session. So a pre-session is, I'm sure you have done this many times, just basically introducing yourself as a professional interpreter. And this, I think, is what differentiates a professional interpreter from somebody that may be bilingual but has never worked as an interpreter, right? And so this really is just a professional introduction, and these are some of the things that we suggest that you include. And the reason why I think the pre-session is so important is because it really brings, I think it reduces the anxiety of everybody. When you come in kind of with a set of rules saying, hey, I know what I'm doing. That's kind of what you're doing with the pre-session. So of course you're identifying yourself, whoever you're working with. If it's a new family, you got to let them know that, I've had interpreters that add, my services are free of charge, because sometimes our families feel that we're going to charge them for the services. There's so many misconceptions about what we do. Confidentiality is very important. So you may want to say something like, everything that you say in this room will be safe. I'm not going to share it with anybody, right? Accuracy means, of course, saying everything that you hear. And that little phrase is really important, because as interpreters, part of our code of ethics is to repeat everything that we hear. If we are in a virtual environment, for example, if we see something on the chat, that is something that we have to interpret, because our responsibilities as interpreters is to make sure that everybody in that room has all of the information, just as if everybody spoke the same language, right? So accuracy means whatever you hear, you're going to interpret. So for those of you who collaborate with interpreters, keep that in mind, that our responsibility as interpreters is to interpret everything that we hear. That's why it's important to make sure that not everybody speaks at the same time, because we cannot catch up, right? So everybody has to take a turn to be able to allow us the opportunity to interpret. Transparency, impartiality, self-explanatory, but you can say something like, I'm a neutral party. I'm not able to give you my opinion, but I will share everything, any questions that you may have, right? Pauses, I may raise my hand if I need you to pause. So if I raise my hand, if you're in a virtual environment, you're going to have to really put your hand towards the camera, because with so many boxes, they may not see you. But if you're, in a in-person setting, it's a little bit easier to have a sign, an agreed sign, so that people will know that they need to pause. Also for clarification, I may raise my hand if I have a question about a term, or if I need something to be paraphrased or changed, right? So all of those components you need to have in your introduction. Of course, your introduction needs to be for the English speaker, but also for the parents or the patients, right? So you have to do it in both languages. So, those of you who speak Hmong or Vietnamese, you have to do it in English and the other language as well, because we want the families to also receive this information so that they can help us interpret more efficiently. So really emphasize the, side conversations are difficult. I'm sure for many of you have had that experience with side conversations, when, you're trying to interpret, and at the same time you hear somebody else speaking on this side, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I do this, right? So the pre-session really kind of warns people and says, okay, I can only interpret what I can hear at a time. But if you do not let people know from the beginning, the expectation will be different, right? So make sure that you have this little, it should take less than 5 seconds, honestly, when you say all of these things. And the more you practice it, the better, the faster you will become at it. So I do have an example. Let's see. Of course, it's in Spanish only, but we're working on actually having these translated in other languages. But this is just an example of what it should say. So you see the one in English on the left and Spanish on the right. The pre-session is very personal, so you may not have to say all of this. If, for example, if you work with the same team, you're not going to introduce yourself every single time, right? But you may say something like, just remember, if I raise my hand, that means I need a break, basically what you're saying. Or I may intervene if I have a question, because you have already given them this information ahead of time. If you work as a team, which it sounds like your organization does, send this ahead of time to the whole team, right? So that they know, okay, this is how we're going to introduce ourselves from now on. For the parents, you may need to give them the whole spiel, right? But for the providers, especially if you work with the same team, you may just have like a summarized version of this. But again, this is just an example, and it's not, something that you have to use specifically the way it is here. But I do suggest that you have all of those components that I mentioned so that you can come in kind of with some tools already. Okay. So how many of you have used the pre-session before or have introduced yourselves in this way before? No? Okay. So Elizabeth, how do you usually introduce yourself when you interpret?
I have used some of these components, like you said, depending on the situation and my familiarity with the person that I'm interpreting for, or the provider. This is really helpful to have all these pieces so that we can see more clearly, how we might be able to use them.
Yes. And so when you start practicing in a little bit, try it, right? Try some kind of an introduction if you've never done it. Try something like this, make sure that you, like I said, mention that you're going to raise your hand if you have a question, that you may ask for clarification. And again, you're doing this in both languages. So you do have to do it in English and also in the other language that you speak, or languages that you speak, right? Because again, we're trying to inform everybody of the rules. So my students, they always hear me say that, not doing a pre-session is like asking you to play Monopoly with no rules. So here we're going to play this game and I don't know what we're going to do, right? But when you come in and kind of give people some guidelines, it just helps to ease the situation. And hopefully it'll eliminate some of those side conversations that are really difficult for us to interpret. It will kind of give a notice for people that, okay, I may be interrupted because the interpreter has a question, and it's perfectly okay. So it does help to kind of solve some of those issues. Not everything, but it does help. So, okay. And I'll give you a copy of this one, and also kind of a list of the guidelines or things that you need to include in it so that you can have it for reference. Okay. All right. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about is the different types of interpretation that we usually practice in our settings. So most of us do consecutive interpretation, whether you're working in a school or in a medical facility. It's basically just taking turns, which is kind of what you're going to be practicing in a little bit. Manageable portions is subject to interpretation. So for example, if somebody is giving you really lengthy paragraphs to interpret and they do not pause for you, likely the interpreter is going to be inaccurate, right? Because it is impossible for us to hold so much information in our short-term memory unless we're really good at taking notes, which is a whole different skill, right? So those of you who collaborate with interpreters, just make sure that the chunks of information are, 3 to 4 sentences at a time. If you're adding a lot of technical vocabulary, they need to be a little bit shorter for us to be able to catch up. And the whole idea is to allow the interpreter to be as accurate as possible. So the more concise the information it is, the better we'll be able to interpret. Of course, abbreviations, jargon, all of that makes it really, humor, sarcasm, all of that makes it even more difficult for us to interpret. So just, really keep it simple. That's the bottom line. And simultaneous interpreting, we do that a little bit in certain settings. And we'll talk about, for example, in mental health, in emergency rooms, we tend to use simultaneous interpretation because of the setting, right? With mental health or counseling sessions, for example, you do not want to be interrupted, You don't want to be interrupting the speaker when they're, telling you their feelings, right? So you have to work on simultaneous interpretation, which is almost at the same time as what the speaker says. So, if you have to interpret for a setting like that, just kind of be prepared that you may need to use simultaneous interpretation. Also for discipline matters and things like that, it is expected for you to know how to interpret simultaneously. So that skill is a little bit harder, but all of us can do it, right? It's just a matter of practicing. So how many of you have had experience with simultaneous interpretation? Any of you? Okay, so it's not scary. And one thing I do know is that it is really difficult in many of our languages because we have to wait for the whole sentence for the verb basically to happen before we can start interpreting. And by the time we do that, we lose a lot of the other messages that the speaker is speaking, right? So it's really not an easy skill. But I will leave you with some resources so that you continue growing in this area, because sometimes you may be in a meeting where consecutive interpretation is used, and all of a sudden the speaker starts speaking really, really fast, and you're going to have to switch or intervene and tell them to slow down, right? So really, as interpreters, it is important that we are, constantly changing from one to the other, and that we work on all of those skills at the same time. So it is not impossible, I promise. One of the best ways to practice simultaneous and really consecutive is using, TV, commercials, radio, when you're listening to the radio, just kind of practice interpreting. It doesn't have to be really technical information, just start with something easy, especially with simultaneous. Something easy, something that you enjoy. If it's cooking, whatever, try to interpret at the same time as the person is giving you the instructions, because all you're doing is really exercising your brain to do it over and over, and that's what it takes. So it's a lot of practice. And then the last skill is sight translation, which I know we do quite a bit of that in our settings. That means that somebody is giving you a document and they're asking you the document is in English, they're asking you to read it to the patient or the parent in the other language, whether it's Spanish, Vietnamese, or more, okay? So that's what it is. It's an oral interpretation of a written document. So with sight translation, it is really important that you always have the provider with you. What I wouldn't do is, let's say that somebody gives you a list of, instructions for follow-up care. And they say, okay, Carlos, go ahead and read this out loud to the parent, and I'll be right back. So what I wouldn't do is to start interpreting that information without somebody there, because what happens is that the parent or the family asks a question and it'll be directed to you. You don't need to have that responsibility, right? So make sure that you always have the provider with you, so that if the parent has a question, then you can turn to the provider and say, okay, this is what's happening, right? So make sure that you always have that person with you. When you're sight translating, the documents should not be too long. So if it's something more than one page, even just a paragraph is plenty. If it's more than one page, that means it needs to be translated. It needs to have some other, option for you. But sight translation should be for short paragraphs so that you can manage that information during a meeting. If it's longer than that, that document probably needs to be translated at a later time. Okay. Any questions about that?
Anna, do you have a suggestion about how you would address that with the person that you're interpreting for in a way that wouldn't maybe be seen as abrupt or negative, but to still get the point across?
Are you talking about sight translation?
Yeah.
So that one, and that is, it is pretty common that somebody will come and say, just go ahead and do this and I'll be right back. That is pretty common. I think it is important that we, that we're there to assist, but at the same time that we explain the expectations to the providers or to the teachers, whoever you're with. So I think, part of that could be done during the pre-session, but another solution is, let's say that I say, okay, go ahead and read this. And, if the parents have any questions, just, reach out to me, right? What I would say to the provider is, can you please summarize the information for me so that I can interpret it for you? So if they say, site translate this whole page, I would not do that. I would say, no, actually, can you please summarize it for me so that I can interpret it for you? So that's a solution. You can, because then you're back to being the interpreter and not the owner of the information. So I think one of the things that you need to remember as interpreters is that anything that you say is your responsibility. So it could be your responsibility because many of you have, again, many different hats. So it could be that that's your information. But what I would do is to take it back to the teacher or the provider and ask them to own the information so that you can go back to being the interpreter. Does that make sense? So do you think that that works in your setting, Elizabeth?
Thank you. I think it would. That's a practical way to address it. It's happened to me in meetings before, I think, and I wasn't always sure how to address that. So thank you.
Absolutely. And that happens, for example, in schools. Sometimes if you are in a special education meeting and they share the parent rights, which is a really complicated document that has quite a bit of information that is specific to special education and what, parents should do or expect from the school. So it's a really important document, but it's about 14 pages of very legal, legal information. And so a lot of our interpreters, the teachers will hand the brochure to the interpreters and say, just, take your time and just read this out loud. Well, 14 pages is going to take a long time, number one. Number two, is a very complex document. So if it's a consent form, for example, for surgery, you don't want to be site translating that information because you may miss some sections that are important, right? So it is important to make sure that it goes back to the owner and then ask them to summarize it for you. So, but going back to simultaneous, just a couple of things. Again, it is mostly used in mental health and emergency settings. So, if you are called upon as an interpreter to work in those settings, just kind of be prepared that that's, it is more efficient. And especially, again, with emergency rooms, there's no time, that we can waste. And so emergency rooms really expect interpreters to be familiar with simultaneous interpretation. Usually for, things like PTA meetings, parent-teacher association meetings, or disciplinary hearings in schools, and any type of large group setting type of interpretation, simultaneous will be more efficient because otherwise the meetings will take a whole lot longer. So usually it is expected for interpreters to do it almost at the same time. It could be confusing, right? If you're speaking at the same time as like a mosquito in your ear, right? Almost. So you do need to say something at the beginning in your pre-session. If your intention is to do simultaneous, mention that in the pre-session. The interpreter will be speaking almost at the same time as the speaker. So if you hear me, whispering to the parent, that's what I'm doing, right? So it is important to kind of explain that in your pre-session from the very beginning.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So with us folks that have like ADHD or auditory processing difficulties, do you have any suggestions for that? Either the parents that are participating or other people in the room that might be distracted by that, because I think simultaneous translation is amazing, because the way my brain works is very hard for me to be giving both of those things attention at the same time. So I just wondered if you had any sort of advice for that.
I do. Let me show you what that advice looks like. So it is very distracting. If you are not using some type of equipment, and so a lot of interpreters you'll see using this type of equipment, which is super expensive, but it works in many ways because of that, because it's not distracting to everybody else. The other reason it works is because you can have many different languages in one room. So it makes it very inclusive. So no longer we have to put, the Hmong speakers in one room because here's the interpreter and then the Vietnamese. No, everybody's in one room together and they all have their own little headset. So basically the interpreter will have, this headset that you see on the left, which is kind of what I'm wearing right now. And then the parents or the patients or whoever you're with will receive one of these transmitters and they have their own headphones. I don't know how they're doing now with COVID and all that stuff. That is, some another concern that we have. But the point is that the parents or the patients or the audience, they're going to hear this information through the headsets. And the interpreter is expected to do simultaneous because, they'll be speaking at the same time, but you will not hear the interpreter.
That makes sense. I guess I never really thought about how the United Nations is able
Yes.
to meet at the same time, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yes. Yeah, and this is exactly what they use, and you'll see the little headsets. Sometimes there's not a whole headset, but just a little earbud. So they've gotten pretty fancy. It is technology, and technology sometimes fails. It is battery operated, but it is pretty pricey. So of course, a lot of school districts do have this type of system for their, large group meetings, ESOL meetings, and things like that. And they're able to pay for these, this type of equipment through federal funding because it does increase parent engagement. So, and yes, and some systems do have different channels. So it's like a radio station or radio that you pick the radio station. You have your specific channel for specific languages. So again, you can have everybody in the same room. So does that answer your question, Stacy?
Yes, very excellent. And also, now that we're able to use you guys for interpretation for our trainings, if there are people here that hasn't been in a Zoom meeting where you have multiple languages interpreting simultaneously, it's really awesome because you can turn on interpretation services and see what the English speakers are seeing, but be in your own channel per se, kind of like a radio, and you're hearing it in your preferred language. So that's really awesome feature of Zoom, and I'm sure other systems have that too. But I'm learning about that now, so very cool.
Yes, and that is, we're so happy that's finally available. I don't know of any other systems that are using it, so I think Zoom has a great idea.
I'm
to be
sure
able
they've
to do
cornered
that.
the market as of now, but it's only a matter of time until more
Oh, yes.
people jump on board.
Absolutely. So this is one kind of what I summarize in terms of side translation, or just again, if you are collaborating with an interpreter and you will be sharing some documents with the families, for us as interpreters, having those documents ahead of time is really, really helpful. Because again, we'll be able to read through them and say, okay, I'm not sure what this is about. I need to get some information. So having as much information ahead of the meeting will help us, including some of the documents that you will share. But if you are sharing documents during the meeting, just help us to summarize that information so that we can interpret it for you. Okay. All right. And this is just an example of something that, consent form, it's pretty short. Like I said, side translation should be definitely not a whole page. That's a lot of that would be a translation. But even if it's something short, you still will have a lot of technical terms that you may not be ready to interpret on the spot. So even if it's something short, just kind of review it with the provider or the physician, whoever you're with, or the, school personnel ahead of time, because they might, it might include a lot of vocabulary that you're not familiar with, and that you have to figure out how to interpret. So side translation is definitely not easy. All right, so consecutive interpretation sounds pretty simple, but I just want to kind of emphasize how much work your brain is doing for those of you who interpret when you do consecutive interpretation. So you're really, you're listening, you're capturing all that information in your short-term memory. I do recommend that you try note taking. And again, that's a whole different, skill that I won't be able to have time to show you here. But, it is important that you use notes to support your short-term memory, especially if they're sharing information that is pretty, technical, right? Because you will forget some things. You will forget, numbers, names of people, sequence of things, right? So those things are really important to write down. So highly recommend you always have your water with you, and you always have something to write with if you're interpreting consecutively, because you will need that information. When you interpret simultaneously, you may not be able to take notes, right? Because you're just focused on the verbal. However, always have something to write with, because it might be a term that you will learn and that you will use for next time. Okay. So you're listening to this information, you're putting it in your short-term memory, you're taking notes, you're rebuilding it in your brain, you're reading your notes back, and then you're spinning it back out, right? And then you're listening again. So you're doing this over and over and over again. So the process is just amazing when you think about it. And it does take time. So I would say that, 5 to 9 units of information, even shorter than that, if it's new to you or if it's a lot of technical information. And as interpreters, feel confident to ask the speaker to slow down, feel confident to pause, to ask them to pause. You are going to be the one that kind of manages the flow of communication. So the speaker sometimes, the interpreters are so good that the speakers will forget that you're there. So they'll just keep on going. So when you practice in a little bit, some of the paragraphs that I'm going to ask the speakers to say in English are going to be pretty long on purpose, right? Because as interpreters, I want you to feel confident saying, whoa, slow down, right? Or can you repeat that again? So yes, there will be a little bit longer. Some will be shorter, some will be longer, but because the expectation is that you speak up, otherwise they'll just keep going, right? So you are the one that needs to kind of manage that communication. It is a workout, a mental workout for sure. Note taking, super important. And again, I should be able to give you some kind of a handout on how to get started, but it is something to explore because it will help you with consecutive interpretation, especially if you're working with a counselor in a mental health setting. You do not want to be intervening for a pause, because when somebody's, sharing really personal, emotional information, last thing you want to do is interrupt them, right? So your notes are going to help you to not intervene as much, okay, if you are not ready to do simultaneous. Memory skills. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt that.
That's okay.
That idea of note taking. Sometimes, we may be in situations with families who have a story that they need to tell us, or some background or history, as we're talking with them, and it may get long, and it is, I know I've been in the dilemma of trying to make a decision about how long I can wait, before I need to interpret, because then the information can be lost. So I think that note taking is such a good point to address, and also just, I think I have that question sometimes about, especially a family and especially in an emotional conversation, when they're needing to tell something that is really more personal or deep. Do you have maybe ideas about how interpreters can work with that situation so as not to interfere with the flow, but at the same time not to lose, like a really long, large amount of information, but not to traumatize the parent or to, does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And those are, really situations where I would definitely have that meeting ahead of time with the provider or the counselor, whoever you're working with, so that you as the interpreter can mentally prepare ahead of time. Because they get really difficult. Sure, we talk about interpreters being neutral and impartial, and we don't get our emotions, and we're human beings. And some of these things will really, really get you. So I think taking care of yourself is really important, and having those conversations ahead of time is really important. But note taking is crucial in those settings, and it's also very important to not summarize the information, not omit information that you think, as an interpreter, you think it's not relevant. So we've had situations, for example, that, we asked the parents a question about the child's motor skills. And the parent starts talking about, okay, in my country, he used to do this and this and that. And, they go through the whole story. And if you as an interpreter start selecting what to interpret, you may miss really important information about that story. So I think, accuracy is very important in that case. Even if you think that the information is not relevant, it could be very relevant, for the physical therapist who's trying to assess. So really, note taking is crucial. And also understanding that in those settings and mental health settings, sometimes the notes will be part of the record. So keeping in mind that you as the interpreter, if you're taking notes, you may be asked to provide those notes for the provider, because they may have to become part of the record. So I don't know if that answered your question, Elizabeth, or if that helps a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Absolutely. So practice, practice, practice. And again, I'll leave you with some tools to be able to practice on your own, because these are skills that you will have to switch. Even in one meeting, you would be using all of them. So it is important to kind of be comfortable with all of the ones that you have. So, all right. So now we get to your practice time. So let me show you what we're going to be doing. Let me share my screen. Okay. So Elizabeth, you can help me with this one. I have a couple of scripts. One is related to school matters, and the other one is more related to medical. What would be more beneficial? We could do both.
I think it depends on who it is. For us, it'd be school. For others, might be medical.
I know. It's like, so let's see if we can do both. We'll do a little bit of both. How about that? All right, we're going to ask for, let me show you what I have. So what I want you to do when you actually come into your breakout room. All right, here it is you're going to see this. Yes, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So what I want you to do is, number one, practice your pre-session. Even if you have not written it down, just kind of think about the process that we talked about. My name is so-and-so. I work for whatever agency, sorry. I will keep all information confidential. I will not share it with anybody else. Just remember that I'm a neutral party in this process. I will not be able to give you my opinion. If I have any questions, I will raise my hand. If you're going too fast, I will also raise my hand. Sometimes interpreters will say, please speak slowly or please avoid jargon. If you have an abbreviation, I may ask a question, or you can say something like, please give me 3 to 4 sentences at a time so that I can interpret accurately. So you will say that, that doesn't take that long. And then you will say the same thing in your language. So I know for our Hmong speakers and Vietnamese speaker, we may not understand what you're saying, but we trust you. But that's kind of the idea. So introduce yourself as if this was an actual role play, okay? An actual setting. So one of you're gonna have 3 people in your breakout rooms. One of you will be the parent in this case, okay? One of you may be the school psychologist or speech pathologist. I can't remember which one this is. Or this might be a medical one actually. And then the other person will be the interpreter. Okay, so let's say that Elizabeth, let's say that you are Dr. T. So Elizabeth will say this information in English. The person who's playing the patient will have to say this information in their language because the patient does not speak English. So here you're practicing sight translation because you're reading information in English, but saying it in another language. So if I say, okay, Carlos, you're going to be the patient, you will say all of this in Spanish. Okay. And then the interpreter is interpreting for both. So whoever's doing the interpretation, what I would suggest is to not open the document because I want you to listen to what the people are saying. Just, in real life, interpreters don't have a script, right? So if you are the interpreter, if you're playing the role of the interpreter, don't open the document so that you can actually listen. And Kimberly, excellent job. Take notes. Try to take notes so that you don't intervene as much. So you see that some of the paragraphs are a little bit larger, right? Lengthier. So the expectation is that you intervene and you manage the flow of communication if you're doing the interpretation. Okay. So you have a couple of role plays here. Yeah, I think you have 2 per. When you're ready for somebody else to be the interpreter, then just, kind of switch hats. And then see how it goes. Okay, and if you want one related to school, I'll give you the other one, but I'll come in and out of the breakout room so that I can see how you're doing. Does that make okay? Now, okay, what were you saying?
Okay, so what I was saying is that as an English speaker, it was interesting to try to figure out where to determine to pause so the interpreter could take over. And I had a tendency to want to not give too much to overwhelm them. So I would stop in the middle of a sentence, which actually I think made it harder for them because then it would leave a weird ending that I would have to go ahead and say. And then when they say it in Spanish, it didn't flow together. So really figuring that out and seeing each other's body language and seeing, is very as important as the person that speaks English really needs to think about that when they're talking is I guess what I was trying to say.
Agreed. I was like, ooh, I probably should have finished that sentence.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. And I'm glad. And that's the reason why I think having a training with all of you together matters because you get to see what it's like on the other side. And it's a little bit harder to do it with a script because you're connected to the script. But in speech, usually you stop after a chunk of information, like a unit of meaning. So usually you do that. It's just when you start going, really, really fast, or when you give us way too much information, you can see what happens, right? The interpreter has to intervene. So it just kind of stops the flow of communication. Very good. Good. Anything else? So there was a little bit of terminology there that that perhaps was new to you, and that's perfectly fine. So I was telling the group before everybody joined that it doesn't have to be, perfect the first time. right? It doesn't, there might be some words that you will not have never heard before, and it's okay. So it's not the expectation that you know everything that will be thrown at you, and that is okay. That's why you have somebody there with you. So this is definitely what happens after a session of interpretation, right? Especially if you're interpreting simultaneously, super taxing, very taxing on your brain. But even consecutive, if you want to focus and really do it well, it'll take a lot of brain work. So it is perfectly okay to be exhausted after. So how to get better, just so that we can, leave you with some resources using the news, really something simple, start with something small, try to repeat it at the same time in English first. So when you're trying to get better at simultaneous interpretation, for example, if you're watching TV, repeat what the person is saying in English first. As interpreters, don't try to interpret yet, just because basically what you're doing is training your brain to listen. And so a little bit at a time, you'll start repeating things in the other language, and then you'll get faster and faster. So this helps with, really practicing consecutive and simultaneous interpretation. Recording yourself while you're watching. I like TED Talks. The reason I like them is because they enunciate the words really well, and sometimes it's a topic that interests me. So I have more investment. My brain is invested in what they're saying, so it does help. Sometimes you have the subtitles in TED Talks, so you can practice your side translation really easy. Something that you can do over and over, and then recording yourself will allow you to kind of see your progress over time. And it's just you and the recording, nobody's watching, right? So that's a really easy way to practice. In terms of resources, lots of resources out there. You have in the clearinghouse for educational translators and interpreters, you have clips, video clips to practice. So these are maybe 3 to 4 minute long little video clips. I don't think that we have them in Hmong, but I will check, but I know we have them in Vietnamese and Spanish. And these are just parent-teacher conference or usually school-related topics where you can stop the recording, pause, interpret, and record yourself. So really easy, free tools to continue your growth as interpreters. And I'll send this link as well for you. A couple of dictionaries that are really good if you are interpreting, but also translating. Wordreference.com is a great resource, and they also have an app that you can use on the phone. Of course, for languages, as Hmong, I don't know that they have a lot of resources, and that's one area that we really need to work on to make sure that you have the tools you need. I do know that they have it in Vietnamese, but don't know how accurate it is, although the Spanish is pretty good. So Word Reference, and then Lingui, it's another resource, and the reason I like it is because it's not just a glossary, but it actually gives you an explanation of the word in context. So it's a little bit easier to figure out which is the right term. So those might be two options for you. And then again, on the clearinghouse, you have a lot of links to different websites and different, usually school districts or sections where they have multilingual materials so that you can access information, especially if you are translating documents, they'll have a lot of options for you, okay? And then we have a couple of resources there as well to help those of you who collaborate with interpreters in education, but also in other settings, to those reminders of pausing, giving us short chunks of information, just being aware of the presence of the interpreter as as a collaborator and as a member of your team, so that we can kind of all work together towards the same goal. So I am sure you're, ready to be an interpreter now. Hopefully that this has given you a little bit of a framework of how to do things better or continue the things that you're doing so far. But I want to see if you have any questions for me before we wrap up.
I don't have any questions per se right now, but I just really appreciate all of the links that you're giving us to go and look at. I think we have a lot there to dig into. And I think all of what we've gone over is just going to be super helpful for all of us in, differing ways. So I just appreciate that. And I did send the links that you sent me on Wednesday to all of you already, and I'm sure I'll have more to send after this with the survey. So just to let you all know.
Perfect. Thank you, Stacy. And yes, I will send you all of the links of what I showed you so that you can have them and kind of dig in. And again, it's about just exploring what's out there and then, absorbing whatever you can, but always here as a resource if you need me to. Okay.
Please make sure to fill out the survey that comes to you for this training. It really is helpful to us and we need your feedback. And Anna, also, we just really appreciate your time and effort to bring this together for us. It's been really helpful and informative and fun.
Well, thank you. I'm glad. Thank you very much for your attention and engagement, and I hope to see you again soon.